Everybody's got your test in front of you, I hope.
Well,
Engine repair 1718. All right. Performing a cylinder leakage test. Cylinder leakage test.
you know how hard that is to do on a Super?
If the engine has a distributor, the technician should remove the cap and rotate the engine until the rotor points at the test cylinder's firing point. That's good if you got a distributor and you know that it's in time and you know that nobody's been fooling with it. If you rotate the engine until the rotor is pointing at the test cylinder's firing point, both valves ought to be closed and you'll get a good thing. I had this this little car, and some of y'all heard me talking about it, maybe last semester, I don't know. It was a little Honda that came in here. The guy had crashed this Honda, this yellow one that was that little bitty one. What is it, CRX? Mm-hmm. And he crashed it, but he had a good motor in it, and it had multi-point fuel injection on it. And he bought another CRX. It wasn't a hot rod version. It had the little one.
You got to swap all that multi-port stuff.
Yeah, but it had a 1.5 in it. And the car that was not wrecked, the little blue one, the yellow one was the one that was wrecked. And it was a fancy hot rod one. What he did was, and think about this now, you got single port, you got throttle body injection on the 1.5 and you got multi-point injection on the 1.6. Now, physically, those blocks are the same. There's nothing different about them. But anyway, we got the little blue one that he bought that wasn't wrecked. The car was in good shape. He said the engine was no good. And I said, well, this is a good little thing to learn and experience. Let's just check and find out what's wrong with the motor. And so it sounded normal spinning over. I said, well, that's interesting there, So we put the compression test on there. 1, 2, 3, 4. Had good compression on 3 of the cylinders. No compression on number 4. I mean, none. It didn't have a single, matter of fact, it sounded like it was spinning free. And I said, well, wow, that compression is going somewhere. So then we're going to do a cylinder leakage test. Well, a cylinder leakage test means you're going to bring it around until the valves are closed on that cylinder, and then you're going to put air in the spark plug hole with the valves closed on that cylinder. And like if you got intake exhaust valve closed and everything, they put cylinder. If you hear air coming out of the crankcase, it rings or a piston problem, right? You hear air coming out of the exhaust, it's an exhaust valve problem. If you hear air going into the intake, it's an intake valve problem. Or if you hear air going into the coolant, you got head gasket issues. This kind of thing. There's just all this stuff you can do. All right, so we did a cylinder leakage test that looked really good on those 3 cylinders that had compression. On the one that didn't have any compression, it had no cylinder leakage at all. It was, the valves were seating, piston rings were good.
What was wrong with it?
So it had no compression, but it had no cylinder leakage. And how is that possible?
Cam messed up.
Well, that's a good possibility. That's not what we found. You can see the camshaft.
Oh, you had a valve cover off?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, we had a valve cover off it too. But if you're right, if the camshaft was broke right in front of, and it happened to be broke so that both the valves were closed, you would be good on that. That was good thinking. It was good sharp. But that's not what was wrong with that. And so what we did was, I was scratching my head about it, because I knew, like you workers, you see the camshaft on that one. I said, well, okay. And the fact that it was spinning over so good and all, and it sounded fairly normal, we went ahead and pulled the motor out of there because we had to, put the other motor in that car anyway. And when we got the motor out of it, you can see what was wrong with it. Somebody had tacked that thing out so much that not only did it throw a rod, the crankshaft was spinning so fast that it busted the rod off and knocked it out a hole in the side of the block. And the piston was down there in the bottom of the hole, just sitting there with about that much of a rod on it. And it was missing the crank, or the crank had slapped it out of the way, and it was just turning past it. So that's why it didn't have any compression, but had no cylinder leakage either, because the piston wasn't moving.
Right.
So, but what you said there, that's the first time anybody's ever guessed that the camshaft would be.
I've had one with a hole in the block that big around, and I drove it around 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And it still didn't sling no rod, and it still had good oil pressure. Tell me how that's possible.
Well, it can have good oil pressure even if it's got a hole in the side of the block, but ultimately it's going to throw all the oil out that hole. But the good oil pressure, if your oil gallery is intact, and it can be, because that's just network of drilled passages through the block, and you didn't breach any of those, you're going to have good oil pressure.
Look, I drove that thing around the block of my house. It's like 5 miles.
Yeah.
I loaded up on the trailer in Pensacola, drove it to my house, well, pulled it to my house. Unloaded it off the trailer. I said, I'm going to see if it'll blow up and blow it up. Drove it around.
Yeah.
I pulled it in my shop.
Yeah, probably left a trail of oil everywhere you went. That's always interesting how much some of those things can take.
Yeah.
That one guy, Philip Kirkland, told me that at some dealership he worked at a very long time ago. I mean, it's been 25 years ago. He was working at a Suzu dealership. And they had little Suzu diesels. Mm-hmm. And they had one that they needed the engine, for some reason, I don't know why, they needed to destroy the engine so they could justify replacing it. And I can't remember why they were doing that or what the circumstances were. But he said he drained the oil out of it, and this was on the orders of the service department. He drained the oil out of it, he cranked it up, and he let it run until it seized up. And then he just screwed the drain plug back in with his finger. And he left it sitting outside the next morning, and when he got his stall cleared out, he was going to push the truck in there and swap out the motor. And so he went out there to the truck the next morning, and just for grins, he turned the key, and it fired up. And he drove it into the shop. I mean, you know... I guess it got hot and seized up, because of but it didn't hurt it enough to where it wouldn't start the next morning. That was crazy. Calibrate the leakage tester to read 0% when connected to the cylinder to be tested. Now, if I'm going to do this right, I need to grab a leakage tester and hold it up for y'all to see. Okay? So give me just a second. I'm going to grab one.
People on YouTube would be like, there's
This is a cylinder leakage tester here. See this right here? And this one here, this is a new one. Cylinder leakage tester, basically.
I did a manual one.
Yep, you can do that. Not that hard to do. You got a little regulator right here. You got 2 gauges. And you're going to screw this down into your cylinder. And you're going to hook that into there. But before you do that, you're basically going to turn this knob until you get this thing calibrated to where that is actually on 0. See that? In other words, you're going to turn this. So this is actually without this connected in here, you've got no leakage whatsoever. And so when you turn that knob, you're going to turn that knob until this needle is on the 0 on that gauge right there. See that? That's when you calibrate it. All right. Then when you connect it to your cylinder, this gauge, you don't even worry about this gauge over here. But this gauge over here is going to show you what percentage of cylinder leakage you have. Got it? All right, that's how that works. So,
my Subaru, we thought it was a bit valve. It was missing like crazy on the cylinder number 1. It turned out. I put, you got probably maybe that much clearance from the frame rail and the side of the block where the spark plug holder is. It took me about half an hour to screw it into each one of them things. You know what it turned out to be?
what's that?
One of the clips on the pins on the injectors had moved down.
Oh,
1/4 inch.
That's whenever you or look. I mean, if you can actually look at your
But it would click.
click.
It would click.
Wow.
I listened to that.
Yeah.
That leakage test, does it need to reform when you spin?
Well, and furthermore, I was going to run some additional tests on that neon out there, because that neon out there has got it's missing on cylinder number 4. Now I got the vacuum back up.
What's wrong with that?
I've got to replant that as a bug and let you go let it for a final. That's what I'm going to do. All right. I said, hey, this is a great bug. We can do this. All right. So.
But
anyway.
no, you just put shop air into it.
Yeah, you can just put shop air in there.
Oh, the air goes on the other side of it?
Yeah.
You can put shop air. You don't have to have a set of gauges. All that does is give you the information of how much leakage you got, so you'll have numbers to write down. But you can, if you got a good ear, you can just put straight shop air into the cylinder. Now, if you don't have it on top of the center, sometimes it'll shove the piston down and all that. But you got to be aware of that. But if it can't hold shop air pressure, you get issues anyway. Number 2, it was false basically. The PCM uses the camshaft position sensor to determine when to fire the spark plug. That says true, but that is not true on a lot of cars. They do not fire the spark plug based on what the cam sensor says. That is telling it in the ones that I've worked on and the ones I've been most familiar with. The cam sensor is telling it when it's okay to operate the fuel injector for the next pulse. Number 4.
So do we put true or do we put false?
I would, if you want to get it right according to the answer, keep it true, but I don't like that answer. And like I say, you'll never see anything as foggy as that on an ASE test. Number 4, a blown turbocharger seal can cause white exhaust smoke.
Yes.
That's going to be blue exhaust smoke, not white exhaust smoke. White exhaust smoke is what?
Water.
It's water, that's coolant, whatever. And you remember the one I told you about that had windshield washer fluid come out the tailpipe because they put the hooked windshield washer in the engine vacuum. Just sucked all of it right on out of the windshield washer through the motor. That's the blue sweet smelling puddle on the ground under that. Repair of the engine is needed if cylinder leakage tests are repair of the engine is needed if cylinder leakage test, that doesn't even make sense. That question's not worded well. If the cylinder leakage tests more than how much? How many percent? What's the percentage that you don't like? That's 5.
5 not even on me.
30%. I mean, that was number 5, question number 5.
Oh, you're saying 5%.
Yeah, no. Technician A says cylinder leakage test can help the technician evaluate the severity of an engine mechanical problem and pinpoint the cause. Technician B says the cylinder leakage test can detect faults with valves, rings, pistons, head gaskets. Who's correct? Yeah, C is right on that. And then number 7, a burned exhaust valve is indicated if air escapes from the air is heard at the tailpipe. You better have a quiet shop though, and be listening really, really close because you may miss it if you're not. Remember what I was talking about? How we put we brought it up on top. We knew that number 1 had no compression on that 3-liter Taurus engine, and we brought it up on top dead center compression on number 1. So that both the valves will be closed. And we took all the spark plugs out and we pumped smoke with our smoke machine in the number 1 cylinder, and smoke came out on number 3. So what does that mean? If you're pumping it in,
from both and it's pumping it through the intake.
yeah. So you got the valves closed on 1. So which valve burned? Is it pumping it through the intake? You got to know where that number 3 cylinder is in its travel. When number 1 is on top dead center compression, where is number 3? 14, 25, 36. 142536 is the firing order on the 3-liter Taurus, right? 14, 25, 36. So when 1 is on compression, where's the rest of it? Yeah. So where is it at on the exhaust stroke? Huh?
Yeah. Power stroke.
No. It's not exhaust stroke.
It's got to be coming up on the exhaust stroke. If you look at it. Yeah, 14, 25, 36. I mean, you got to be able to think about that stuff. What that told us, we did the smoke test thing, understanding how the engine worked and knowing what the firing order was, we understood that the exhaust valve was letting the smoke get into the exhaust system, and it was making its way out the number 3 spark plug hole. That gives you more information. Every piece of data that you can gather in a way that makes sense is going to be added to your total portfolio on that problem. And I just love having that neon out there that's skipping on number 4 for some unexplained reason, because it makes a tremendous teaching tool when you finally work your way through it, It's annoying when you got it in your stall and you got a bunch of other cars you need to fix, but when you're teaching, it's great. What?
Did you figure out why it had no vacuum?
Yes.
Well, the problem with the no vacuum was because underneath there was a great big seal where the EGR pipe goes in right under the throttle plate, and he had left that seal out. And we were measuring vacuum right by that huge leak that it had. It actually had vacuum.
So
We just weren't.
vacuum the whole time.
We weren't measuring it because it had a huge, gigantic leak, not an inch from where we were measuring it. And you couldn't hear it. And when we put the smoke in there, when we smoke tested the manifold, there was smoke came like boiling out of that place right under the throttle body there. All right, which was crazy. Where Sean's at this morning? I guess I might send a mortar strike over to wake him up. All right. Technician A says the condition of the vehicle should be considered before replacing faulty valves in a customer's engine. Right? Don't you think so? I mean, if the vehicle ain't worth fixing, you remember Latanda's little '94 Mitsubishi Diamante or whatever the Sam Miller was? Had that V6 in it, and it had both head gaskets were blown. On that
Both head gaskets were blown?
Yeah, both of them were blown, and they was just getting all kinds of coolant in the spark plug. I mean, in the combustion chambers and all that. And boy, I tell you what, even doing it here, putting, by the time you replace the timing belt and all the head gaskets and all that other stuff, you'd be spent $500-600 on a car that probably wasn't worth $40. This is one of the things that you got to understand, though, and I've seen people do this before. There was a guy that brought it, and some people have the idea that if a car has a new engine in it, the whole car is brand new. You ever seen that? I mean, somebody has an idea, well, I'm going to put an engine in that car, and when I put an engine in that car, I'll have me a new car. Well, there's more to the car than the engine. There was this guy that, when I was working at Ed Davis's shop in 1977 over there at Enterprise, and he had a 66 Thunderbird. It was 11 years old. But a 66 Thunderbird was a beautiful car. It was like a rocket ship on the inside and all that. I don't know if you've seen that.
My grandfather's told me.
Wonderful, stuff. But anyway, he paid us $1,500 to put a new engine in that car. But the rest of the car still needed work, and that's not cheap. If you're hiring somebody else to restore a car for you, you better have deep pockets. 'Cause you're gonna have
11 years old and it needed restoring?
11 years old. Well, in those days, cars just didn't last as long as they do now. I mean, they just didn't. I mean, the more bells and whistles they had on them, the more stuff went wrong with them, and that's why people got the idea, well, there's more to go wrong. They didn't like power windows, they didn't like cruise control, they didn't like a lot of the stuff that we take for granted now. They didn't want that stuff on our car because they knew it just would quit working eventually anyway, and they didn't want to have to fool getting a troubleshot. Well, anyway, one of the things that the guy that I worked with was a mechanic he was really, really, really good. He did transmissions and all kinds of stuff. He could rebuild a transmission, get it ready to put back in before the torque converter cooled off. That's how fast he was. But anyway, if it was a 350 turbo hydromatic, and that's really, a lot of people might be able to do that. But the point is, he says, what this guy doesn't understand is that you can spend $1,500 on a $300 car and wind up with a $400 car. You're not going to get the money dollar for dollar back that you put into it. It's kind of like when you buy a brand new car, like that Hyundai out there, probably would have cost $20,000 if you bought it new, that purple one we got. If you bought each and every part of that car the year after it was made, the fenders, the headlights, the wire harnesses, and all that kind of stuff, you probably pay $80,000 for the parts that it would take to build that car. But the way that they buy that stuff in bulk, see, it's different. Anyway, I got on a tangent. What am I doing here? All right. Technician B says replacing faulty valves will restore the compression pressure. Ooh, who's right about that? If the valves are faulty and that's all that's wrong, both of those guys are correct, but it can have other problems. Please, just remember that. You got to make doggone sure that you don't have a problem with your rings. I mean, see, like if you got, let me hit you with this. What if you've got a burnt valve and you've also got some broke rings on the same cylinder? And you've gone and you see what I'm saying? You've done all this valve job crap. Now you still got no compression, and you already gone all back together with it. And somebody's done a bunch of work, and a customer ain't gonna pay you for that, or you shouldn't charge him for it. Oil consumption can be the result of what? Can it be excessive spring tension, a faulty vacuum modulator, worn valve seals, or insufficient skirt clearance? Number 9. Valve stem seals are going to be the answer to that one. And number 10, Technician A says the oxygen sensor should be replaced if engine coolant has been burned. What did I say the other day? What's engine coolant got in it? A lot of these engine coolant's got silicone in them and other stuff that coats that ceramic zirconia in that oxygen sensor, and it just doesn't talk anymore. And what they get ticked off about, if you don't tell them going in, whenever you're doing the cylinder head job, you say, while we're at it, just go ahead and write as comprehensive. Don't sell them something they don't need, but say, we need to go ahead and replace the oxygen sensors too. Either that or you say, you may need oxygen sensors. And my suggestion would be to let's repair it, drive it, see what the oxygen sensors look like on the scope, on the scan tool. If they're sluggish, then we'll replace them. If you don't need them, we won't put them in there. And they appreciate that kind of thing. But if you tell them going in, you may need oxygen sensors, then they're not ticked off and upset when you call them and say, hey, by the way, you need $160 worth of oxygen sensors too. Both of them are dark. Well, why didn't you tell me this before? They want to know going in. They don't mind paying if you tell them going in. All right. Technician A says, wait a minute, excuse me. Technician B says white exhaust smoke usually indicates a blown head gasket. Usually, but not always. That's the SC, basically. 11. Technician A says excessive piston skirt clearance can cause piston slap. Now, the piston skirt, everybody talk about that. the piston skirt is here. That's a skirt. And if the piston's able to do this, it's going to cause what you'd call piston slap. Every time it comes up and goes down, it's going to kind of rock back and forth in the cylinder and clang, 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 clang. It's going to hear. You're going to hear it. Something else might want to do too. When you get pistons in your hand, get it out of your engine. And Wes has probably had 8,000 pistons in his hand already. You know, as much work as it is. You have too, I imagine. If you tap them like that, with something like your pocket knife or this piece of bolt, if you got one that's cracked, it will sound really dead. Dum, dum, dum. It'll sound click, 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 and you hit it on the other side, it sounds like. It's got a kind of a lower thud sound to it. So if you look at a piston, you won't always see the crack right away. Sometimes you will, usually will, but if you don't, this right here is a good way to tell.
I had pulled the piston out of a car. As soon as I pulled that out of the bottom, after I took the crankshaft out, pulled it out of the bottom, broke in half.
Yeah. Well, and furthermore, you know, they got these tools for doing the carbon on the rings, you know. In other words, whenever you go around and around getting the carbon out of these ring grooves, and that fancy little tool, if you keep ratcheting it in every time, it'll start taking a little bit of the aluminum out. And I have known of people getting so zealous and trying to get every last little stain of carbon out of there and wanting it to look brand new in there, they take enough of that that metal out that it jerks the head off the piston. You know, the piston comes apart and the head's just kind of up here, and the rest of the piston's going up and down in the hole. Snatch your head right off of it. And, all right. Hey, Sean, got you a Red Bull? You have another all-nighter or something? Or?
I had a blowout on my wife's car, so
Oh,
I
my
dropped my tire this morning.
Oh, is that exciting?
But
Did it hurt?
All right.
Well, I got it back out.
Yeah.
You know, you broke
That was the grease that he had on his face when he left here yesterday. No, I'm kidding. You know, on something there. Okay. Wait a minute. Technician B says piston slap cannot be repaired. Technician that B is wrong. You know, some of that, and I really, you know, I always kind of liked Fords. Of course, I like Chevrolets and Chrysler too. I'm not really against any of them, but some of the Fords had piston slap from the factory, and what they would do, they had us to pull the pistons out and send them to the machine shop and have them knurled. And when you knurl them, it makes it just a tiny bit bigger, and that way that did away with the piston slap. That was the cheapest way to fix that because they didn't have to replace all those pistons. You see, it's really something what they'll do under warranty to get one out the door. No. I mean, if you got make all up zillions of cars. Technician A says excessive crankshaft end play can cause engine knocks or clunks on acceleration. Technician B says a worn thrust bearing can cause excessive crankshaft end play. Now, you know the thrust bearing is the one that that gives the crankshaft.
Not all of them have it.
Yeah. Some of them will have it on the very
On the
end of
main
the
bearing.
crank. Yeah. Now, they'll be on the main bearing. Some of them is separate. Some of them only have it on one half of the main bearing. That's weird. Ford Tempos, the little cast iron block Ford Tempo motors. Now they've got it only on like one half of the main bearing, the one that I saw did. But anyway, that's you know how you got your main bearing, and you guys, all of you guys that have done engine stuff, that's what a main bearing looks like, right? Okay, so some of them will have a little sort of a flange on it on both sides, like that. You see. And you may even also see that it's got little oil grooves cut in it, like that. But I mean, if that one there, it'll look like that, and that's what the thrust bearing is. And if the thrust bearing is worn out, though, what wears it out? What can wear out the thrust bearing so that the crankshaft moves forward and backwards? If you got worn out thrust bearing and you just jerk it apart and you throw a thrust bearing in it, you don't find out what caused that thrust bearing to wear out, you may be working on it again.
What caused it? Where?
If the torque converter is flexing too much and it's pushing forward on it too much, you get a ton of fluid pressure in the torque converter, and that metal is really thick. But if you get one that is actually expanding a little too much and it pushes a crankshaft forward against that thrust bearing, it'll do that. If I'm working on one with an automatic transmission and everything was right as far as the way it was put in, you know what I'm saying? If there wasn't something shoving on forward on the crankshaft all the time because somebody didn't put something together right, then I would say we could probably put a torque converter in there just because, because you got to motor out anyway. You know what I'm saying? Because you're putting a crankshaft in it. I mean, even if you're putting the crankshaft in with the engine in the frame, and you can do that because I've done it before, you still got the transmission out.
Right.
You got to have the transmission out to do that. So because you got to pull the flywheel off, right? All right. So go ahead and say sell them a torque converter. They don't cost all that much. If somebody has got if something going on with the clutch, you know what I'm saying? It'll, like if you got a pressure plate that's super strong, like Zoom or something. If you're pushing on it super hard all the time, every time, if you got to just stand on it and you're pushing forward on the crankshaft every time you apply the clutch, a little bit. So there's a lot of stuff that we don't think about, and it's just kind of plain as a phase on your nose whenever you get done with it.
What do you call the place under the car where you put your jack?
Huh? Say that again.
What do you call it?
Pink wheel.
Where you put the jack under the car? What do you call it?
Oh, you talking about you talking about the pinch weld on the side?
Right.
Yeah, I call it a pinch weld, but I mean there's that little notch where you put the jack to raise the car to change a flat.
What's that called?
We always call it a pinch weld. I don't know what the real name is for it. I mean, I'm sure the auto body people have got some name for it, and they may be calling it a pinch weld. But all my life, I've always heard it called that. But one of the things that I noticed when somebody jacked up the Crown Victoria the other day, they put the back of the lift under the sides of the car body, and that's not where that goes. You put it under the frame.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? If it's not unibody, you always put it under the frame. Unibody means that the frame's molded as a part of the car. And that's where you find a good solid place on the unibody to put it if you can. But the pinch weld is strong. If they've got a place, if it'll hold if the jack, when you jack up the car, if it'll handle that, then you put a lift there typically. They make books that tell you about lift points on cars, but almost no shop ever has one anywhere. You just raise it up. And you don't hardly ever have issues with a lift. If somebody's doing their job like they're supposed to be, you're not going to have a lot of trouble with a lift. Right. I mean, with the cars falling off the lift. I mean, unless somebody's just plumb stupid the way they raise it up, Now, one day somebody, because they get used to the pinch weld things, and you think you've taught them and you think they've got it and all this kind of thing, and you put it under the frame. If it's a pickup, you put it under the pinch weld. If it's a unibody car, you put it under the frame. If it's something like a Crown Vic. And then they take the Ranger, the Ford Ranger, and they put some of the lifts, my little trainer truck, put the lifts under the side of the bed. The Sam Hill does that do, about the time they get to raise it up, I see it starting to bend the bed. Stop that! Set it back down. You see, put it under the front of the spring, All right, when performing a cylinder leakage test, the technician should remove the radiator cap and the what valve?
What's 12?
The PCV valve. Oh, 12 was C. All right, number 14. The leakage of the oil cap or dipstick tube when you're doing a cylinder leakage test means what? Come on, guys. What is it? Oil fill cap or dipstick tube?
It's oil cap seal.
Rings. Well, the cylinder leakage test, I'm sorry, Shelley, you made me laugh. What the cylinder leakage test is done with this thing right here. There was a worksheet, that I gave about doing cylinder leakage tests. And you get the cylinder with both the valves closed, and you actually are going to, with the air pressure plugged into this from the shop air, you're going to dial this in where that reads 0. And then you're going to, put this in your cylinder, make sure it ought to be holding air, and, snap that in there and juice that thing up with air, and you want to see how much cylinder leakage you have. If you got cylinder leakage, you can listen and you can tell where that air is going. Did you know I used one of these to find out that the injector was leaking fuel on a Lexus SC300?
How'd you do that?
I took the fuel filter off and I pressured up the fuel system with 40 pounds of air pressure.
Oh, okay.
And then you could hear it hissing into the intake. And when I unplugged all the injectors one at the time, when I unplugged one of them, that hissing went away. And I found out that the engine controller was keeping that injector open all the time.
Really? It wasn't injected?
Nope. And when you unplugged the injector, it quit. Couldn't be the injector. The injector was doing what it was told. Now, a shorted wire harness between the injector and the PCM could have been a problem. That's why what we did on that, we went and unplugged the PCM. See, you only did it with the key on. Turn on the key, the injector fired up, you get in the ground on the signal coming in.
Well, hold on, man. If you unplug
Unplug the PCM, it quit hissing.
Yeah, but I mean, if you done that, it would do it anyway,
No, well, I mean, it depends. The PCM does not supply power to the injector, it just supplies the ground. The power comes from somewhere else.
Right, okay.
So if you unplug the PCM, the power's still going there, but it went away. We sent the PCM off to A1 Cardone. They rebuilt it for $450. We brought it back, put it in. He spent like $4,000 on that car everywhere else trying to get it fixed before it came here.
Because they had one of 2 jets in orders.
Yeah, that was a smooth running engine.
Yeah, they are. I mean,
I don't like the those Corvettes. Some of them come with the dual Spitfire motor.
Yeah.
Stand them.
Well, if the leakage,
Crossfire, whatever they're called.
if the leakage at the oil fill cap is near 100%, the technician should suspect damage to a what? Piston. If the piston's got a hole in it, it's going to do that. 16. To ensure the valves are closed and the rings will be at the highest point, the technician should turn the engine over by hand until the cylinder is at TDC. But it's supposed to be TDC compression, not just TDC. Everybody needs to understand that. You burn that in. Piston blank occurs when there's too much clearance between the piston and the cylinder. Piston slap. We talked about that a few minutes ago. See, we're burning this in here. A clogged or frozen blank or hose can cause a tremendous amount of exhaust smoke. PCV. You know PCV can make it burn oil.
yes.
A
I had
partial-
mine hooked up wrong on my drift car one time when I first put the engine in there. Didn't know how it had to be hooked up. I had it looped around. I didn't know. It's crazy.
You just learned about that. Didn't you? You were like, oh no, my ring didn't see. Okay. Let's see. 19. Oil that's contaminated with what may cause major bottom end damage? Fuel or coolant, either one, please. Yeah. And then you got a partially clogged or restricted catalytic converter could trigger the MIL and set. And set a DTC for low catalyst efficiency. I do not even like that question, and I'm going to tell you why I don't like that question. The catalyst efficiency, which is a PO420. Remember what I told you about catalyst efficiency is supposed to be storing oxygen, and the oxygen sensors in the front and behind the catalyst, the back one's supposed to be lazy and the front one's supposed to be snappy. And if they're both switching at the same rate, then that means the catalyst is not storing oxygen, and that means you got a bad catalytic converter. But what they're saying is if it's clogged, you're liable to get a PO420. But I don't even go there because a lot of times it ain't clogged worth a flip, but it don't store oxygen. So that's, I don't know. Some of these, I don't know what pocket to put some of these questions in. All right.